Hi everybody, this is Bastian and this is the third and final installment of my annotation of my pet line against the Sicilian. So, in order to demonstrate, I'm going to annotate the game I played against a 2400 opponent that we're going to use as a stem game. So this is the starting position. We've discussed the d5 move, which leads to the Tal Gambit decline of the Sicilian Grand Prix. We've discussed d6, a move designed to undermine White's pawn island. And now we're going to look at the move g5, move which serves the same purpose, undermining the pawn island. Now, if black were to play g6 and fianchetto the bishop, we can see that the bishop is blocked by the pawn on e5. So typically, when black is facing an unfamiliar system, he tries to stick to his own system and slightly modify it in order for it to become effective once again. So g5 is a common reply, undermining the pawn island and allowing black to continue with his system. So g5 is played, and now I play d3 to counter the pawn loss on f4 and continue protecting the pawn on e5. Black plays pawn take pawn, I recapture, and he develops the bishop to g7, adding an attacker on the pawn on e5, and I develop the knight to f3 to protect the pawn. Now keep in mind that this move order doesn't have to be played like this, it can be interchangeable. So instead of pawn takes pawn, black may develop his bishop first, then knight to f3, and only then pawn takes pawn. So that's also possible. But the pawn capture was played first. And now black plays d6, adding a third attacker on the pawn on e5. So black is playing against the e5 pawn. Now, again, when black is faced with an unfamiliar opening, he will not only try to find a way to stick to his own familiar systems, but also try to find a way to refute the opening. And I've had this played against me several times, and the point of which is actually pretty clear. Now, there are three attackers on the pawn on e5. If I recapture, we can see that the b2 pawn is hanging, after which the a1 rook will become under attack, which looks bad for white. However, white cannot add another defender. Say if queen to e2 is played to add a third defender, black can simply take the pawn, and I can recapture either with the bishop or the knight. So if bishop recaptures, we get knight takes, then knight recaptures, and queen to c7. And we can see that the knight on e5 is becoming overloaded, and if the knight moves, we can see that the b2 pawn is hanging, and the rook on a1 will become under attack as well. And there's no real way for white to defend his knight or retreat it properly. So let's say knight to f3, then bishop takes pawn, knight b to d2, and we can see that white has lost a rook. It's not even an exchange sacrifice, because the queen has moved to a2 in order to protect the pawn. Now keep this queen move in mind. We will see what happens if white doesn't move the queen. So if not knight to f3, but d4 is attempted to protect the knight, Then simply pawn takes pawn, queen to knight to f3, and white is simply down a pawn. So that's losing for white, and black has won the opening. If queen to b5 check, an alternative, black can play king to f8, so the threat remains. Now knight to f3, queen takes c2, again white is losing pawns. So the d4 move to protect the knight will lead to pawn losses for white, so it shouldn't be played. If instead knight to c4 to protect the b2 pawn, then b5 can be played to kick the knight. Knight to e3, bishop takes, same problem, white will lose the rook. So if we go back, the bishop move cannot be played. Alternatively, white can try to recapture with the knight first. So let's see what will happen next. Knight takes pawn, and then simply queen to d4, and we can see that all of white's pieces and pawns are under attack, and this position is absolutely lost for white. So if white tries to continue with knight takes knight, queen takes bishop, knight to a5, and bishop takes b2, again white is losing the rook. So the queen move to defend simply shouldn't be played. What white should play is simply pawn takes pawn and allow the loss of the pawn on b2 and the rook on a1. So bishop takes pawn, knight b to d2, and we can see the main difference. Now the queen is still on d1. White will not lose the rook, but it will be an exchange sacrifice. Black took the rook, and at this point black thinks he's winning the game, but it really isn't so. Although black has a material advantage, white has a huge positional compensation. It's basically mathematically equal, but with such a positional advantage, black will have to fight hard to maintain the draw, and there will be tactical shots on every turn, and it will be impossible for black to defend against all of them. So queen recaptures, and we can see the threat already. We are attacking black's rook on h8, so white's queen is very powerful on the diagonal. So there are two ways to defend. Let's say first, if a random move is played, a6, queen takes rook, king to e8, bishop check, king to e8, queen takes knight, king to d7, queen takes s7, king takes pawn, bishop f4 check. It's clear that black is losing in this position, so there are only two possible moves. Either knight to f6 or pawn to f6 to block the diagonal. Let's say knight to f6 first. This move wasn't played. There are two possibilities. Knight to e4 will add extra pressure to the knight, immediately with a check. That's already winning for white. But I prefer to undermine the defense of the knight with pawn takes pawn. So pawn takes pawn. It's a little bit more complex. Now there are three possibilities to recapture the pawn, two of which will protect the knight. let's say knight recaptures. This simply queen takes, of course. Rook to g8, knight d4, and then if say a6, knight to d6 check, king to d7, knight d5 check, king to c7, knight e8 check, rook takes, knight c4 check, king to d7, queen d6 mate. So this gives a clear idea how much trouble black is in already. So of course the knight recapture move is bad. There are two realistic continuations: recapture with the queen or the king. So let's say if the king recaptures, then we get bishop to g5, and we can see that all black's pieces are hanging. King to d7, bishop takes, forking rook and queen, rook e8 check to get out of the fork, king f2. The queen is still under attack. Queen to c7, knight d4, threatening knight takes pawn check, b6, so these are just possible continuations. Bishop to h4, threatening a fork, rook to e6, knight f6 check. Of course, the knight cannot be recaptured. If king to d6, we get bishop to g3, forking king and queen. If king to d8, we get a check with an attack on the queen. So it's easy to see how lost black is in this position, and the tactical shots are not hard at all to find. You should pay a few seconds to look for them. So the king recapture is very dangerous and bad for black. So if queen recaptures, check, knight should block. Then if a random move is played, a6, white's main threat is bishop to d6, trying to kick the queen off of the defense of the knight. And there are two possible squares for black's queen to go to if he wants to protect the knight and prevent material loss. Let's say queen to d8. Then white can continue. Knight takes knight, getting a free minor piece, check. Queen recaptures, and black is losing, so retreating doesn't work at all. If queen to e6, we get knight to g5, threatening the queen, so we're trying to kick the queen back off of the defense. Queen to f5, to keep protecting the knight, and then knight takes knight, check. Only one possible escape square for the king, that's king to d8, and knight takes pawn, fork and mate. And the only thing that black can do to prevent it is sacrifice his queen at this point. Again, completely losing for black. If black doesn't play a random move and instead recaptures the knight, say knight takes knight, then of course queen can capture on h8, check. If queen d8, then queen takes queen, king recaptures, and pawn takes knight is losing for black, where black has lost a minor piece. If instead king to d7, white can play pawn to g3 in order to activate his bishop on h3 to hunt for black's king. And if a random move is played, say a6, then bishop to h3, check, and all black can do is block the check with his queen. If not a random move, but say queen to e6 first is played to cover h3, white can play pawn takes knight, and white is up a minor piece. Of course, if black recaptures the pawn with check, we can see that his king is becoming undefended, and black's attack won't work. King to f2, queen takes pawn check, bishop to e2, and black's king is still cut off, and white can bring his rook to the open file on d1, and black will be lost. So to summarize, if black recaptures the pawn with the queen, white should kick the queen off of the defense of the knight, and white will be winning. Basically, the knight defense will fail, but black tries different defense and plays f6 instead to protect the rook. So I continue with bishop to e2, a developing move, one of the few moves in the game that isn't a tactical shot. Getting ready to castle and developing the bishop, also protecting the king in some cases of the open e-file. Black recaptures the pawn on d6, knight to e4, so I'm threatening knight takes pawn. Now knight to d6 is going to be played anyways, so black advances the pawn to d5 to save it, and that's the best move. So knight to d6 check. If king to e7 is played, and this wasn't played, we can see that black's king is still on the open diagonal, on the open file. So white should castle. Then if say b6 is played, I can play knight to g5. Of course, the knight cannot be recaptured, not only because of the rook recapture, but if pawn recaptures, queen to g7 check, king to e6, bishop g4 is made. If instead a random move is played like a6, the threat is bishop to h5, cutting off the king, and looking to play rook to e1 check. So that's the danger of keeping the king on the open e-file. If instead of something else like b6 is played, let's say d4, to block the diagonal, so it doesn't have to be a random move, I can play queen to e1 and place the queen on the open e-file. Then if say a6, same problem, knight to g5, and if black captures the knight, bishop to g4, check, king to f8, bishop takes, and I'm threatening the queen, check, king to g7. Of course I could capture the queen now, but more logical would be to keep chasing the king. Rook f7 check, king g6, queen e4 check, king takes bishop, queen d5 check, king takes the second bishop, rook g7 check, king h4, g3 check, king h3, and queen to g2 is already a mate. So after knight to d6 check, leaving the king on the open e-file will lead to complications. It wasn't played. Black plays king to f8. I castle. And now it's difficult for black to find a way to continue. If he tries to develop the knight, say knight g to e7, white could play queen to f6 check, king to g8, queen f7 mate, to give you an idea at how difficult the position has become for black. So we're noticing black hasn't been able to develop his knight for the entire game. Let's say if something else is played, let's say bishop to g4. Let's say black tries to develop the bishop. White can play knight to g5 again. The knight cannot be recaptured simply because of bishop to g5, check, attacking the queen. If then bishop takes on e2, knight to e6 check is a fork. So we can see that the bishop development doesn't work either. Black tries b6 instead, hoping to fianchetto the bishop and protect the pawn on c5. So I continue with the knight to g5 move. Of course, again, if pawn takes, check, and white wins the queen. So we're seeing the same problem. If a random move is played like a6, white can play knight to f7, forking rook and queen. Also bishop to h5 is a solid development move for white, so that's also possible. So there are plenty of opportunities for white. Queen to e7 was played instead. Now I play bishop to h5, developing the bishop. So we're seeing the king being more and more boxed in. Again, if pawn takes knight at this point, same problem. We are seeing the queen still being on the diagonal. And if knight blocks, bishop takes, queen takes knight, and then bishop to d8 check, king to g8, bishop f7 check, king to f8, queen takes rook is mate. So at this point we're seeing more serious problems than simply losing the queen. So after queen to e7, bishop to h5, the knight recapture cannot be played. Black tries bishop to e6, knight takes bishop, queen takes knight, rook to e1, threatening the queen. Queen falls back to d7, bishop h6 check, knight recaptures, queen takes pawn check, king to g8, queen takes knight. Now if say queen to d8, we get bishop to e7 mate. So that's the main threat for black. Black instead tries rook to f8, and this leads to queen to g5 check, queen to g7 to block the check, bishop f7 check. Of course the queen is overloaded, so the king cannot recapture because of the knight. Black is forced to recapture with the rook, rook e8 check, rook to f8, queen to d5 check, queen to f7, and queen takes queen mate at move 25. So that was my game using the g5 variation of my pet line in the Sicilian, which leads to a very exciting game with a lot of tactical shots on every turn in unfamiliar positions. I hope you give it a try and you enjoyed watching this video. Please leave a comment and have a great evening.